In part 3, we discuss how COP28 does not bode well having an oil boss as the president, and how all these strands come together to reinforce the notion that the UNFCCC process is set up to fail. Following episodes include a discussion with Mike Hands, founder of the Ingatree Foundation, about regenerative agroforestry, providing a sustainable alternative to slash and burn, potentially improving the lives of millions of families living in the tropical zones and vastly reducing emissions from this climate-vulnerable region. I also discuss the unfolding tragedy of the world's coral reefs with marine biologist Professor Terry Hughes at the James Cook University in Queensland, Australia. These are two fascinating discussions going deep into ecology, both on land and at sea. Live now for all members is an interview with methane expert Dr. Ewan Nisbet. Ewan discusses new observations of wetlands and how they could be signalling epochal change in the Earth system. But when you come back to the Paris Agreement and what it's setting out to do, and we've got these NDCs, and you used that example just then of Switzerland going around buying all these cheap tons. Ultimately, that means we're never ever going to really get to where we need to go, because we're just trying to fleece a system which is without penalty. And we're going into this next COP, which is run by an oil man, CEO of the national oil company. This doesn't bode well for anything, does it?
No. First of all, I don't think it's a good idea that we're putting an oil man or woman, any oil company in charge of this process, mainly because we're now at a serious point, right? I mean, everybody can see there's massive heat waves over all of Europe, right? There's massive heat waves. We've had whatever. There's been like a record 20 days in a row in Phoenix of above 110 degree temperatures. Death Valley set a record. The temperature at midnight was 100. So, we're warming up, and so we are past the time of these sorts of games. And I think that, no, we should not have let an oil company do this sort of thing. And this other deal, which I did want to mention, the very problematic deal is the deal that many people have been writing about in the literature for a while, saying this particular deal with the voluntary market intersecting with the compliance market will undermine the Paris Accord. It's a deal that Microsoft just did in May. This is when a rich company pays a country to reduce its emissions that it had already committed to Paris, and the country counts that in their inventory, claims the tons, and says we officially reduced our emissions. And to give the specific example, in May, the Danish government issued a press release and said the Danish company Ørsted is going to put carbon capture systems on 2 Danish biomass plants, capture the carbon, bury it under the Norwegian Sea. And the Norwegian government subsidized that with funds from a fund that was set up to fund carbon capture and carbon removal. It put it into inventory. It said, we're claiming these, we're using these to meet our Paris target. We claim the tons, we bought the tons, we claim them, we're going to officially use them. That's a perfectly fine deal. However, Microsoft kicked some money into this deal, and Ørsted sold them Microsoft the same tons that it sold to Denmark. And Microsoft is going to use them to offset their emissions. And so they've, all three of them, by the way, independently said, well, they're 2 different accounting systems, right? One of them is the voluntary market, one is the official market, compliance market. And a reporter asked me, how can there be 2 different accounting systems? And I said, well, one of them is real and one of them is pretend. This is a ridiculous deal. It is the equivalent of admitting that the voluntary tons aren't real tons, right? Because the real tons went to the real country who actually had the emissions in their country, reduced the emissions in their country, claimed them, and is using them officially in their globally recognized inventory. So on the one hand, this deal shows that the voluntary market is completely meaningless. But it's bad for Paris because, again, the point of Paris was nations of the world get together and make these commitments to create an incentive for each country to reduce their own emissions. But if any country like Brazil could just sit around waiting for a rich company to pay them to do this, then suddenly they're disincentivized for doing it themselves, right? They can just wait long enough some company is going to pay them now. And you don't want to set up a system, right, that has disincentivized people from acting now under the hope that someone's going to fund them later, which may or may not occur. So this deal is a bad deal. The Danish government didn't do anything wrong, except, of course, that Ørsted is majority owned. It's the former Danish oil and natural gas company, right? It's majority owned by Denmark. And even though Ørsted told me in an email that there's a firewall and the Danish government doesn't tell them what to do, the fact of the matter is that the Danish government is actually responsible. If you're majority owner, right, you are responsible for the actions of that company. So this is a bad deal. The parties need to be held accountable. I don't know who the Danish regulator is. My guess is if the Danish regulator were shown this deal, they would have a lot of problems with it. This deal should stop. And what that ultimately means is that the voluntary offset doesn't make any sense anymore. The voluntary market only made sense in a world where the real world wasn't taking this serious and there wasn't nationally accounted tracking of tons. In that world, okay, if the world's not doing something serious, then maybe it's an okay thing for rich countries to fund projects in poor countries. Maybe some good will come out of that. And who cares if the rich company says, oh, I reduced my own emissions, right? It's not hurting anybody. It only starts to hurt somebody when there is a real market. And then the fake market really screws up the real market.
And we've got so much cynicism right now about all this stuff, about COP, about the progress that hasn't materialized since Paris. And then you've got this sort of climate colonialism, which is exactly as you called it. And then you've got this Microsoft thing, which is probably not the only one. There must be loads of these things.
No.
This is like lying. It's deceiving the process, which is meant to be working towards something. And we're going into a COP has an oil boss as a president. I mean, this all sounds catastrophic. How do you see a way out of this? I mean, what's the good story coming out? Is there one?
Well, 30 years ago, I was acting assistant secretary for energy efficiency and renewable energy at the DOE, and I was at the Department of Energy for 5 years, and all of those I was working on clean energy, and 3 of them, I was helping to run the program, the $1 billion program. So we put money into wind and solar and batteries, all these things that took 20 years to really pay off. So, but in the last 10 years, obviously the price of these things have been coming down steadily for 30 years. Compared to when I was in government, solar is 99% cheaper. I mean, it's unbelievable. Batteries, things that you couldn't even imagine, right? Electric cars 20 years ago were considered, now they're the hottest thing, and in 10 years they're already taking over the market. And in 10 years, I don't even think no one's going to want to own an internal combustion engine car because it's going to be worse in every single category that matters. So we have seen a clean energy revolution. What we have to do, however, is significantly ramp up our funding. I mean, in these areas, if we want to meet these targets, right? I mean, we've seen the technological improvements, but we dawdled for so long, right? I mean, 30 years ago, right, was the Rio Agreement, was the original agreement. The UNFCCC was set up at the time. So, and the first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report was, I think, 1991. So the point is, scientists have been begging us, right, to take action for 30 years. We ignored them. Emissions have kept going up. So we don't have time anymore for just nice gestures. Yes, it's good that the U.S. spends, and it's a big deal, by the way. The U.S. is spending a few $100 billion, maybe more, to put clean energies in the marketplace. The biggest thing the U.S. has ever done. And I'm not saying countries aren't doing things. The problem is we've dawdled for so long. What we have to do is simply a lot more than what we would have had to done if we'd started 20 years ago. So, I think it's now the negotiators have to step up and start getting serious. For instance, at COP27 in Egypt, the negotiators explicitly looked at this deal. The world at COP27 could have said, we are forbidding the Microsoft deal. We are forbidding a deal that mixes up the real stuff with the fake stuff. That they could have done. They're the only people who could have done it. The voluntary market, no one can tell the voluntary market what to do. But the Paris people can tell the Paris nations what you can't do, right? But they punted. They said, no, we're not going to. The issue was, does a voluntary offset need to have a corresponding adjustment attached to it or not? That was the issue. And in Egypt, they said, nah, we're not going to decide, right? But the correct answer is they needed to decide. So the answer to your question is every single country has to step up their game and stop, doing this gaming of the system.
Is it because you have countries like Canada, the US, you've got Saudi Arabia, Qatar, say Britain, Norway, etc. They're all expanding their oil production and gas production, and probably are relying on these dodgy schemes to greenwash themselves out of it. Yeah. So if they made the rules stricter in Egypt, they would be making it tougher for pretty much the most powerful people inside the COP to keep doing what they're doing. And that comes back to our countries, who are really a big part of the problem.
Well, look, the fundamental, a fundamental problem with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is that it's got to be unanimous, right? You basically have 190 nations that all have to agree. If one or two are kind of sour about it, sometimes the guy will gavel it, the head or woman will gavel it through. But basically every nation has to agree to this, which means Russia does, China does, the United States does, Saudi Arabia does, Brazil does. And I'm not saying that it's a bad idea, but there are very few political bodies in the world that can operate and do anything where the requirement has to be unanimity. I mean, places where you just need 60%, it's very hard to do anything, as you may know. You have, obviously the British government operates, understands that. Parliamentary systems understand that. So in some sense, the Paris Agreement was kind of miraculous, right? Now, the miracle was, of course, that it wasn't enforceable. That's why people could agree to it, because they knew at the end of the day, if they didn't meet their target, there was no enforcement against them. My perspective, and I think a lot of people who were involved thought we didn't mind that, because if you promise to go to net zero in 2050, in 10 years, the climate is going to be a whole lot worse than it is today. So it's going to be a whole lot harder in the year 2033 to say, oh, we're not doing this. We've warmed 1.2 degrees Celsius and everyone can see what it's doing to the world. So imagine what happens when we get to 1.5 or 1.6. So it will get harder and harder for countries to simply walk away from pledges when, the world is even more obviously in bad shape. But
does it also make the case that humanity's best achievement is set up to fail, because we can't have that accountability, we can't have that bindingness in the deal, because no one wants it really. So really, we are admitting failure, and I know the complexity of all of this, but just the bare truth of it.
This is always a complicated matter, with the perfect being the enemy of the good. How much imperfection is allowed before the thing becomes meaningless? That is, at the end of the day, what the question is. The world wasn't doing anything, and I think Paris set up a very good framework that certainly allowed countries that wanted to do good things, and it made it harder for the ones who didn't want to do good things to lollygag. But still, there were these gameable things left in the agreement. The correct thing to do is simply to eliminate the offset provision. That's Article 6. Article 6 is the trading article, and Article 6.4 is the part about offsets. And what the world should just do is say, these are jokes. Paris said we're going to keep warming to well below 1.8 degrees Celsius, and we're going to work really hard to try to get to 1.5. Subsequently, the UNFCCC asked the Intergovernmental Panel, would you please do a special report and tell us what's the state of the science on 1 point, we used to think it was 2 degrees C that was the threshold for which things got really bad. And would you take another look at the science? And the IPCC said, hey, turns out 1.5 cc is, you get beyond 1.5 cc, things start getting pretty bad, and we don't know where the tipping points are. So this is where the whole notion of going to zero in 2050 came out of, really, because the IPCC said, well, if you want to do that, you have to be net zero in 2050, and you need a 45% reduction by 2030 compared to 2010 levels, right? In other words, you have to get your ass in order, right? You have to really put the pedal to the metal. And that is what accelerated things. Unfortunately, it was kind of obvious at that point that that wasn't going to happen. And I personally felt it was not a good idea to keep misleading people into thinking that it was going to happen. Now, I'm here as a scientist to say we could do it. We could still do it now, right? I mean, Greta Thunberg were king of the world, queen of the world, right? I'm very confident that we could do it. People might not be happy with how it was done, but I can assure you they're going to be less happy in 10 or 20 years. Our children are going to be cursing our names. So, what we think is bad now, imagine what it's like when sea levels are rising a foot every decade for the next 200 years or whatever. So you could say that Paris was set up to fail. You could say, by the way, that the clean development mechanism was set up to fail. People wrote such articles. I think that it is important, from my perspective as a scientist. I started doing this because my brother lost his home in Hurricane Katrina, and he asked me if he should rebuild his home. That was August 29, 2005 Katrina, and that ended up getting me looking into the science, talking to scientists, reading literature, and coming to the conclusion, that this problem was a lot more serious than I thought, and that scientists weren't doing a good job of communicating. And that's when I ended up launching the Climate Progress blog that people probably know me best for. So, I don't think there's any point in pulling any punches. It remains the case. Every day the technology gets better. It gets cheaper. The performance improves. The performance of batteries, are improving steadily. And what's more, the studies have come out recently that have said, if you're on a learning curve, if your cost has been going down steadily for 20 years, it's almost certainly going to continue for the next 20 years, right? In other words, it's not going to stop. Solar is going to keep getting cheaper. Wind's going to keep getting cheaper. Batteries are going to keep getting cheaper. So, and what it also means is if you spend more money now, you accelerate this whole process. The learning curve is typically if you double the amount of that you sell. If you double the capacity, the price drops 20%. That would be like a typical learning curve. So obviously, if the governments speed up deployment now, they're making everything cheaper for everybody faster. So it's kind of frustrating when you know what the answer is, and the answer is actually not only straightforward, but it's a self-reinforcing good thing, that we're not doing it. So I'll be the first to admit that, and I don't want people to lose hope there. But I don't want people thinking that, the political system of the world is not set up to do 1.5. At this point in time, keeping below 2 is going to, that's going to require people starting to get serious right now. To do 2, you don't have to be net zero in 2050. It would be okay sometime between 2060 and 2070. But the point is that you still have to start reducing emissions rapidly now. There's no scenario where continuing to go up in emissions or even remaining flat isn't a complete disaster. And to get back to your other point, the International Energy Agency said just like 3 years ago, if you wanted to hit the Paris targets, you would have to stop investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure now, because the current fossil fuel infrastructure will provide us all the fossil fuels that we need to blow past those numbers. So yes, any country, which includes the United States of America, which continues to build liquefied natural gas terminals at an obscene rate. I just think it's one of the worst things we're doing. People are under this impression that natural gas is somehow a solution to this problem. If you build a natural gas power plant today, you are making things worse. You can pretend you're replacing coal, but the fact is the next power plant being built isn't a coal plant. It's a mixture of gas and renewables, and it's mostly renewables. So every time you're not building renewables or a very low carbon system, you are literally making the problem worse. And to pretend, oh, this is better than coal, that's what people go, this is one of the most frustrating things to me as an analyst. And I'm doing more papers. I'm going to have a paper in September on bioenergy carbon capture and storage, and then one on direct air carbon capture and storage. And everybody compares their technology to coal, and they say, well, this is better than coal, so it's a good idea. No, that wasn't true 10 years ago. What we need now is only zero carbon or very close to zero carbon. Mm-hmm. Beating coal, that's like saying, oh, I didn't commit a double homicide, right? It's only involuntary manslaughter. Do not worry about what I've just done. No, that's not the comparison, right? The comparison is you didn't commit any crime at all, or you're making things worse. To the real wonks out there, when you read a paper, when you read a study, a life cycle analysis, when you read something that says, oh, biomass is good because it's better than coal, you need to say that's a load of crap, because that's not what the European Union isn't building coal plants anymore. So don't tell me that your biomass plant is a good idea because it's a little better than coal, because it's twice as bad as natural gas, right? And it's infinitely worse than renewables. So no, your biomass that you're pretending is carbon free, we can get back, come back on, in September and talk about that. But the point is, we can't pretend anymore that better than coal deserves a pat on the back. It does not. It does not. In fact, it deserves that would have been good 20 years ago. Now you missed. Now it's got to be better than natural gas. If you're not building something that is significantly better than natural gas, you are making the climate problem worse.
Okay. Well, look, on that note, thank you very much. It's been very insightful indeed. And I look forward to talking to you again about the future work. Thank you for listening. A reminder that episodes appear weeks earlier for YouTube and Patreon members. This is due to my work schedule. However, support for the podcast enables this work to continue. Thank you.